Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello, my guest is Etan Rosenbloom. He is founder of EtanDoesLA, which is a project exploring Los Angeles history, one landmark at a time. He is also Senior Director and Deputy Editor of Marketing and Communications at ASCAP, the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers. He has formerly been a freelance music writer with Decibel Magazine, MetalSuck.net, Daily Prefix Mag, Billboard.com, Spin.com, and he is exploring the various places listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Nancy.
You have visited some, but not all 600 of those historic places listed in Los Angeles County and the surrounding community. Looking at the list, it's a variety of places, from libraries to streets to homes. What are you discovering?
There's so much that I'm discovering. Part of the impetus for this project was to re-engage with my city during the pandemic. I found that even as a native Angelino, there is so much about the history of the city that I didn't understand, I wasn't taught, or that was just somehow covered over. What I've discovered is that what a lot of people see as either the plasticity of our city or the papering over of history or forgetfulness or apathy towards history in Los Angeles, it's really just a surface reading of what the city is all about. If you dig a little bit into the material history of Los Angeles, you find so many different stories about communities that arise here for different reasons or drawn here for different reasons.
Indeed, there are a lot of historic areas, whether or not it's Little Tokyo near downtown, Angelino Heights north of downtown, or even the Hollywood Hills.
That's absolutely right. A lot of the social histories of these people drawn here in the areas that you mentioned, they're still embedded in the buildings that you can see right now. It's just you may not have noticed a plaque that's there. There may not be a plaque at all. There might not be anybody telling this history. And so by looking at this list of recognized historical places, all of these were nominated by somebody or some organization who believed that they told an interesting story about the development of Los Angeles.
Our built environment is fascinating because we are surrounded by it. We live in it. We work in it. There's some places that are easily visited without special permission, without paying. You can go to Los Angeles Union Station downtown, or Olvera Street, where it has the oldest adobe home in Los Angeles. But if you expand into Los Angeles County, you have a lot of the ranchos, the missions, the homes, and structures, whether or not they're schools, libraries, or other institutions, famous hotels. So many different distinctive architectural types as well.
It's so true, especially going to a lot of the residential spots that you mentioned. Just because there's a place that is owned by a person and maybe even lived in a person, it can still be an incredibly important place. So my dad was an architect, and so diving into some of the architectural history of Los Angeles was especially fascinating to me. I discovered some of my new favorite architects through this project, including, of course, John Lautner. We're sitting in one of his residences right now.
He designed the Pearlman Cabin in Idlewild, California, where we're recording. He was a Frank Lloyd Wright protege. You have different homes from both him and Frank Lloyd Wright and the mid-century modern architects of last century. But you also go back to places. You also go back to natural areas. I know I did the first documentary of the old Susanna stagecoach trail road back in the 80s, but that road has been around since the mid-1800s.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that was actually one of my favorite visits to the old Santa Susana Pass Stagecoach Road. Use of that of course, dates back to Native American times, especially in the years leading up to and through the Civil War. It was just a crucial artery for both travelers, but also mail, to get from LA County up all the way to San Francisco. So there were other routes through the Tejon Pass, I think it was, that were cut off during the Civil War. And so it became a really important way of traveling. This brings up another theme that has really resonated with me in this project, is how important transportation and the development of transportation was to the history of Los Angeles.
In fact, on that list is the very famous Angels Flight Railway. This was a tiny, short little railway going up to Bunker Hill, but it got moved.
Exactly, and I'm so glad that it did. This is one of those crazy stories where you have this very unique attraction. I think it's the shortest train in the world, they bill it as. You have these two trains, Sinai and Olivet, named after biblical hills. After Bunker Hill was demolished, Sinai and Olivet were just put in storage. It was decades before they were dusted off and put back in their current location.
The communities where some of these historic places can now be found have changed. One that's most famous is the Watts Tower, which was designed and built by, I believe, an Italian immigrant. Watts became a black neighborhood. Now the Spanish-speaking people have moved in. Communities change, but yet certain places keep their significance because they're important in other ways to identify a community.
It's a really terrific point. So I had that same thought when I was at the Watts Towers, and I'd visited several times throughout my life as a lifelong Angelino. When you think of Watts, you think of the Watts riots. You think of the jazz scene that was developing there in the 40s and the 30s. You think of Charles Mingus, who came from there. But Simon Rodia, who created the Watts Towers over 33 years, he predated that. He had already left Watts and quit-claimed his property and given it to a neighbor a decade before the Watts riots happened. So you can imagine being a foreigner, moving to the West Coast, moving to Watts, which at the time was not a largely black area, and seeing the makeup of his neighborhood change over time. And at the same time, it's like you have all these different people watching him build this work of art that would develop over 3 decades. And that's one of the beautiful things that arises out of this project too. There are so many stories of all these different groups interacting with each other and creating things that outlast everybody and survive throughout all the demographic and environmental and construction changes that happen.
The communities change in terms of who is there and what kind of religious communities there are. So you have historic synagogues, which aren't used anymore because there aren't any Jews in the neighborhood. You have historic Presbyterian, Episcopalian, or other Protestant churches where those people no longer live in the community. Some of these places have survived, have been remodeled, reutilized. Some of them have been torn down. Just because it's on the National Register of Historic Places doesn't mean that it's going to last forever, does it?
No, not at all. Although there are other historic designations that do confer some kind of protection against demolition or changes. The National Register is not one of them. So you can get some tax benefits if you own a property that's on the National Register, but it doesn't prevent you from demolishing it or making changes to it if you want.
And we have seen that happen with many famous homes by famous architects. How many places are on the National Register of Historic Places in LA County and in Southern California? And how many have you visited?
I can only speak to LA County. That's my project. There are just around 600. There are more being added every year. In fact, there's a historic district right around Carthay Circle, a few neighborhoods right around there that were just added in March. Last weekend, I visited Descanso Gardens in La Cañada, Flint Ridge, which was just added in 2021. So every year, there are a few that successfully make it on. I have visited about 125 right now out of the 600 and posted about 95 on my blog so far.
And that blog is called?
EtanDoesLA.com. I also have a Instagram handle, EtanDoesLA.
And that's EtanDoesLA.com. In addition to this favorite project of yours, which you're doing out of love, you are also the Senior Director and Deputy Editor of Marketing Communications with the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers. That has an important environmental story because they have now developed something called Studio Green. Is that to be sure that productions are are ecologically sound and sustainable?
We're hoping that it's going to develop to encompass that. So far, this is mostly an internally focused campaign. It's aimed at helping ASCAP employees make sure that they're lowering their carbon footprint, that they can be as eco-conscious as possible in the choices that they make in their daily lives and in their offices. You can imagine that that was especially important during the pandemic, where we're not going outside, we're not traveling, we're not adding to pollution, driving in our cars and such. We're an organization of 850,000 songwriters, composers, and music publishers. We recognize at ASCAP that you're not creating in a silo, you're not creating in a vacuum. Everything that you do has an impact on other people. Hopefully your music has an impact on other people, and it has an impact on the world too. So there are parts of the music industry, touring in specific, that create a whole lot of carbon. So there are a lot of terrific organizations that are helping address this problem. They're working with a lot of major artists and tours and promoters to try and minimize the impact of touring and playing live. And so the hope with Studio Green at ASCAP is that we can take something that's internally focused now and introduce it to all of our members.
Having worked in the environmental field for over 50 years, I'm thrilled that finally some of these other organizations are listening to us and making some of these important changes. I wish we had time to talk about each and every one of these 600 plus historic places. The list is so varied. Everything from county parks to theaters to areas including the Venice canals. I'm sure it's hard for you to say which is your favorite, but what was the commonality of each of these places? A unique design, a unique community?
It's a really great question. There isn't one single thread. So there are certain criteria for something to become part of the National Register. And one of them could be that it's an important site for the development of a certain group of Angelenos. So Little Tokyo, like you mentioned. Or there are a lot of buildings along Central Avenue in South LA, like the Angelus Funeral Home or the Dunbar Hotel, which were hugely important as commercial and entertainment hubs for the Black community in LA in the 30s and the 40s. But there are others that are just great examples of a certain architectural style. So some apartment buildings where nobody famous stayed there, but it's like a great Spanish colonial building. And it might tell you something interesting about how Hollywood was developing from single-family homes to multifamily residences as the movie industry was developing. But there are other things like the missions, the mission in San Fernando Rey de España or the San Gabriel mission, where those were some of the only buildings from the early days of Los Angeles that still survive. Personally, those were some of the most meaningful, mostly because they're so contested and controversial. I remember growing up in LA and learning about the mission history. It's important history, Junipero Serra and why the Spaniards came over and all this, but you're not taught about the nasty stuff that happened, the enforced labor, and how it wasn't really a choice if you were Native American to move there or not. Like, there are cases where so many resources were taken up by the missions that the only way to get 3 square meals a day was if you decided, all right, I'm going to go there and be one of the mission Native Americans. They're important historically. They are frequently very beautiful architecturally, and they feel like sacred places. I'm Jewish. I mean, I'm not their target audience, but there's still this strange feeling of silence.
All these historic places have so much embedded history, in addition to beautiful location, beautiful architecture, and we have so much to learn from it all. I wish I could join you on your tour of all these places. I would love to see them all, and I'm glad that your blog is making them more easily accessible to people. We'll be back in a moment with more ecological issues.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I have been speaking with Etan Rosenbloom, who is founder of EtanDoesLA. Some of the places on the National Register are public institutions, so people can visit. Some are private homes. Some are facilities used by other organizations or institutions where you have to get private permission. Which one is the most difficult to access, and which one is so easy?
That's a really great question. So I think the ones that are the most cloistered tend to be the private residences by famous architects that are still lived in and in the Hollywood Hills. So I think the rule is the more money you have to commission a home, the less you want to interact with looky-loos. And I totally understand that. One of my favorite things is going into the expensive parts of town in the Hollywood Hills or Beverly Hills and being like, okay, how do people show off their taste if they have unlimited resources? So to be honest, some of the hardest ones to access are like other John Lautner homes. It's very rare that they're right on the street side, or if they are, that there's anything to look at from the street side. So the Willis Harpel house, for example, like there's a big gate and there's a long driveway and you can get a tiny little glimmer of it. And you can see the Futuro house that's like up on the hill right above it. But you need to watch a video or like look at the original architectural plans to get a real sense of what this place looks like.
What has been your most surprising find when you have visited these places?
That's a really good question. One of the surprising things that I've learned is how hard it can be to preserve a historic place. You would think that history and preservation of such would have an inherent value. It's just obvious. It's like this building tells an important story. And so, of course, people would want to preserve it. But it often takes cooperation between government and private enterprise, and a lot of times nonprofits and community activists that just see the value and don't want to see this structure go away just to preserve it, not even like rebuild. So just a couple examples. There is the Wadsworth Chapel, which is on the West LA Veterans campus, the Veterans Administration campus. And so it is a massive campus, and it's supposed to be dedicated to taking care of veterans, whether they have health issues or they're having trouble finding homes. And there's this century-old chapel that's like right there off of Wilshire Boulevard. In fact, I think it's the oldest building on Wilshire Boulevard. And it has been behind a chain link fence for something like 50 years, just because they can't find the money to spend on it. And the VA would have to spend millions that might be better spent on actual veterans. So I think it's only in the past year that they've found some of the funds to do that. So that's one of the surprising things, just how much work can go into keeping a place up. And the same thing goes with Frank Lloyd Wright houses, honestly. There are some of his textile block homes that are among the most photographed or filmed homes in history. Some of them are in terrific shape, like the Storer House and the Ennis House. It now looks great, and it's because of private capital. Where there are others, like the Freeman House, which I think just found a new owner, but for years it was falling apart. And it's such a historically important building. Like, so many famous people were there just like playing cards and having drinks with the original owners. Lautner and Schindler both helped restore that house, upgrade the plans so that it would stay in good shape.
In looking at the list of these famous architecturally significant buildings and locations, one of the things that I noticed is that not only is the architecture different, unique, special, but the location, the relationship to the natural world. Have you found that people who get these buildings built, people who design these unique buildings, also care about the natural world?
Sometimes. It wasn't always the case. I would say that especially in the early 20th century, when you had this City Beautiful movement that was kind of taking over civic architecture, not just in LA, but it started in Europe. It came to the East Coast and then moved over here. You start seeing buildings and massive parks and bridges that were beautiful on their own, but also somehow harmonized with the landscape. You started seeing architects and city planners caring about having green space. And I think especially in the modernist era, in mid-century, you have like A. Quincy Jones, for example, who built a tract up in Granada Hills where almost every home has like the central courtyard that's just lined with plants. Green and Green, also two of my favorite architects. A lot of the Craftsman homes in Pasadena. So many of those are built with like river rock from the Arroyo Seco. And they use wood to harmonize with the wood around it. And, Lautner's Schaefer House, it was built around the oaks on this piece of property where the family used to picnic. So his idea was to bring nature into the house and to always have you looking out of the house and experiencing it. So even if all these sites, they're not like the sites of some huge environmental movement, let's say, they teach us a lot about how people think about nature and how we're supposed to commune with it. And I would also say that for history and preservation-minded folk in general, there is just such a natural connection between preserving what we create and preserving the environment that surrounds it and creates the materials that we use to build it.
Hollywood is very famous and is part of the city of Los Angeles, except for North Hollywood and West Hollywood, which are separate cities. But I remember from my teenage years, my college years, going to some of the famous places like the Hollywood Palladium. They still exist. The venue is still there. Perhaps the kinds of concerts and programs have changed. And you also have places like the Hollywood Women's Club and the Hollywood Press Club. Lots of Hollywood, including the early bungalows below the Hollywood Bowl that were built to create Hollywood.
Sure. So the bungalow court that you're talking about, the Highland Cameras bungalow court, that was actually one of my favorite discoveries. So I've been driving past that thing for decades and didn't know that it existed until I visited it, because it's sort of walled off by this nice ivy-covered wall. But yeah, it's just this beautiful assortment of craftsmen that I think were built in the 19-teens mostly. There were some famous people that lived there. I think Linda Ronstadt, J.D. Souther, Jackson Browne are all said to have lived there. In fact, Laurel and Hardy, I think, have a connection there. But mostly the folks that lived there were just workaday entertainment employees, your gaffers and your set designers and stuff that were supporting that industry. I should tell you that I was least excited about all of the Hollywood stuff when I embarked on this project, because I just feel like Hollywood history, it's already very well covered. But the more I dug into it, the more fascinating the stories are. Like the Hollywood Studio Club, this was a dormitory for women who were aspiring to work in Hollywood or just getting their feet wet. So a place where you could stay. It was only for women. Men weren't allowed beyond the lobby. And they had, meals provided every day. And a lot of very famous actresses got their start there. Kim Novak, Marilyn Monroe, Rita Moreno, just incredible names. And it was started because in the 20s, there was a real problem for young starlets coming to Hollywood. There was a very macho culture involved with casting. So a lot of women were taken advantage of and spat out. And it was a PR problem in addition to a moral problem and a real issue. So a lot of the studios funded the creation of this dormitory. And so it operated for something like 50 years and then became, I think, more of a hotel. And it's been operated by the YWCA ever since then. You
mentioned some famous names, but if we go back, there are famous names like Will Rogers, and his house is now in a state park. So you can visit it, then start taking hikes into the Santa Monica Mountains. You have other famous people for whom places were named, like library branches. Helen Hunt Jackson, who wrote plays and books. The history is both of people and of places, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. A lot of the places that are on this list, they're on the list because they're associated with someone who's important, like a Will Rogers State Park. But yeah, there are also libraries and other important buildings named after folks who might not even have a connection to Los Angeles. And that was especially the case when I was doing my National Library Week coverage. So I looked at a different branch of the LA Public Library every day of the week for National Library Week. Someone like Richard Henry Dana Jr., there's a branch named after him. He certainly has a connection to California. He wrote his most famous book 2 years before the mast about a voyage that he took on a sailing ship from Massachusetts all the way up over to California. He gave up a law career to become a sailor, essentially, and then became a very respected lawyer and politician and represented a lot of seamen in his time. But he had no connection with Los Angeles itself. So it was just a way of honoring his literary career, I guess. That branch came to be named after him.
You have visited places because they're architecturally significant. They've had an important part of the history of an area. They have an important connection to literature, commerce, religion. Do you think that new places that are going to be added to the National Register of Historic Places will be more connected to their location, to their natural environment?
I don't think that's necessarily the case. These sites are important for so many different reasons. I do think that it's important for people to recognize how the natural world feeds into our experience of the city, and how respecting it and enshrining nature can help even an urban city dweller enjoy their lives more.
I have found that some of these places, because the building is historic, have been able to preserve and protect some of the land around it, whether or not it's a mission, an adobe, a home, a house, a government building. The land around it also ends up being protected, sort of secondarily. But fortunately, it's an important factor.
Yeah, I definitely do think that listing a historic site on the National Register, or honestly, any other kind of list that recognizes historic sites, it sort of has a halo effect, where part of the importance of doing things like nominating sites for the National Register is to make sure that people understand their value, that people come visit them if they're public, and that people are exposed to new parts of town that they might not have gone to otherwise. And a lot of times that involves finding a park that you haven't been to before, or finding this large open expanse of green space, or having a view from a hill that you've never gone to before. I can give you one example. So we visited the Old Mill, which is the oldest commercial standing structure in Los Angeles. It was built in 1816 to basically make bread products and grain for the San Gabriel mission. And so when I find these sites, I usually look at them on Google Maps. So I see right next to the Old Mill, there's this giant green space, and it's Lacey Park in San Marino. And it's this beautiful, it's private, but it's publicly available garden in San Marino right next door. And I went with my family, and I was just blown away by the variety of flora there was there. So it's just one example of how investigating these historic sites can sort of lead you on the path to figuring out what is beautiful about your city and what kind of natural stuff it offers.
I know that when I traveled to all the states in the United States, and I've traveled to close to half the countries in the world, I go to the parks, I go to the museums, but going to individual places that have significance is also enlightening in terms of learning about the history, learning about the environment. Are we going to find that the historic places are going to incorporate more of the factors to preserve and protect the native wildlife?
I sure hope so. And there are a lot of them that do already. So Descanso Gardens, one of the more recent additions, they have a whole native plants garden. And a lot of the most beautifully landscaped historic buildings that you can see, they use native flora. So, for example, Lloyd Wright's Derby House in Glendale, he was a phenomenal landscape architect in addition to being a great architect. He made a point of mostly using native plants right around there.
What's fun about having these places listed and trying to see them is that you go to places in the city, you go to other locales, other environments that you might not normally see. It's a drawing card.
Absolutely, and that's one of the most important things to me about this project, that it provides some kind of structure where I get out of the parts of the city that I'm familiar with. I go see signage with different languages. I go to places like Whittier and Santa Fe Springs and South LA and Rancho Palos Verdes that are very different from each other and very different from the kind of Los Angeles that I grew up with, but they all feed into the history.
I'm glad you're letting us know about them.
Thank you so much for giving me a platform, Nancy.
Thank you so very much for sharing your experiences. Thank you for being my guest.
Thank you so much for having me, Nancy. It is an absolute pleasure to be able to ramble on about my passion project for so long.
Thank you. I have been speaking with Etan Rosenbloom, who is founder of EtanDoesLA. I'm Nancy Pearlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Pearlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.